The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg was hot, bright, and, by all accounts, utterly uneventful, until it wasn't. Imagine the scene. A cobblestone street, market stalls laden with onions, a few locals muttering about taxes, and then one woman, without warning, begins to dance. No lute, no drum, no wedding feast, just her, thrashing and stomping under the midsummer sun like a medieval flash mob of one. At first, people stare, then they point, then they do what humans always do when something looks a bit strange. They gather around to watch, certain it will be over in a minute. But it isn't. Hours pass, then days, and somewhere between blistered feet and glazed eyes, curiosity begins to curdle into dread. This is how the dancing plague begins. But it's not just the streets that lose their grip. In convents, the holy quiet shatters. Nuns meow like cats, bite one another, scream until their throats give out. Imagine the medieval clergy trying to address that in the next sermon without losing the congregation entirely. And the authorities? Well, this is where it gets absurd. Rather than stopping the spectacle, the city decides to lean into it. If dancing is the problem, then clearly, the cure is more dancing. Guild halls are cleared, musicians are hired, and strongmen are employed to keep the afflicted on their feet. If it sounds like they accidentally invented the world's worst music festival, that's because they did. By now, reality itself seems to warp. Ordinary life collapses into a fevered carnival where no one remembers the rules. Somewhere in the noise, the line between medicine, miracle, and madness blurs completely. This is the story of a city on the edge. A story of hysteria, of ritual gone rogue, of bodies that refused to stop moving until they simply couldn't. It begins on a narrow street hemmed in by timbered houses, their upper stories leaning toward each other as if conspiring. The air is thick with the smells of baking bread, horse dung, and the sharp tang of summer heat on stone. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer rings against iron, a reminder that ordinary work still ticks on, for now. In the middle of this familiar scene, Frau Trophia steps out into the sunlight. She is unremarkable at first glance, just another figure in the flow of market life. But then her body jerks forward, not toward a stall or a neighbor, but into motion, sharp, erratic, unbidden. Her arms swing wide, her feet strike the cobbles in uneven rhythms, as if she is answering a drumbeat no one else can hear. Passers-by slow, caught between politeness and curiosity. In a city accustomed to processions, saints' days, and wedding dances, movement in the street is nothing unusual. But this has no ceremony, no musicians, no context. Trophia does not smile. She does not speak. Her gaze is fixed, somewhere past the faces around her, eyes clouded in concentration or vacancy. It is hard to tell which. Minutes stretch into hours. What begins as a curious spectacle soon turns to unease. Neighbors note the way she stumbles but never stops, how her steps repeat like the workings of a broken mill wheel. Children whisper to each other. Merchants pretend not to watch while adjusting the same bundle of goods again and again. Someone mutters the word fever. Another crosses themselves. By nightfall, she is still moving. Not the graceful turning of a dance hall, but the relentless pacing of something driven by compulsion. Her skirts darken with sweat. Her hair clings to her face. A pair of city watchmen, unsure whether this is illness, drunkenness, or something far stranger, choose to let her be. After all, there is no law against moving one's feet. Morning brings no change. Trophia is in the same street, tracing the same erratic loops. Witnesses note her swollen feet, but also the strange absence of collapse. It is as if her body refuses the logic of exhaustion. Some onlookers begin to speak in the language of saints and curses. Street Vitus, the patron invoked against such convulsions, is named in hushed tones. By the third day, small knots of townsfolk come to watch. Bakers carry trays to the windows for a better view. Apprentices take long detours past the site of her strange exertion. A few claim they feel something stir in their own limbs, a tingling, a pull toward the same frantic rhythm. And then, the first imitators appear. Whether out of sympathy, suggestion, or some shared affliction, one woman begins to mirror Trophia's movements. Then a man joins in, awkward at first, then with the same vacant persistence. The crowd shifts from idle spectatorship to uneasy recognition. This is no isolated oddity. By week's end, dozens have joined. Some manage only a few hours before faltering. Others match Trophia's endurance, swaying and stomping under the glare of the sun until their clothes hang heavy with sweat. The marketplace becomes both stage and infirmary, its air filled with the slap of soles against stone and the low murmur of disbelief. The city's chroniclers will later struggle to decide how many took part in these first days. Some will claim 50, others hundreds, but all agree on the sight, a growing mass of bodies, compelled to move without music, reason, or rest. At night, the dancers fill the dreams of those who only watched, their jerking motions replayed in the mind's eye like an unshakable vision. Rumors spread more quickly than the affliction itself, that it is a punishment for sin, a test of faith, or the work of corrupted blood. Somewhere in Strasbourg's narrow lanes, life continues. Bread rises, merchants haggle, the cathedral's bells mark the hours. But for those who have seen the dancers, normality feels thin, fragile, one step away from the same irresistible pull. It is here, in this uneasy mixture of the everyday and the inexplicable, that the dancing plague begins to root itself. Frau Trophia's feet do not stop, and neither, it seems, does the contagion of her movement. By the second week, Strasbourg's streets no longer belong to merchants or pilgrims. They belong to the dancers. What began with a lone woman has swollen into a tide of stamping, swaying, and collapsing bodies. The marketplace, usually a stage for commerce, is now an open-air theatre of compulsion. Estimates will vary for centuries. Some chronicles place the number at 50, others insist on 400. The truth, like the disease itself, resists measurement. Witnesses agree only on the essential image. A mass of people, drenched in sweat, faces vacant or contorted, moving without pause beneath the hard summer Sunday. The sound carries before the sight, the slap of leather soles against cobbles, the low grunts of exertion, the occasional cry when knees give way or ankles twist. Those too weak to stand are dragged aside, only for others to step into their place, as if the city itself demands the rhythm continue. Day blurs into night. Lanterns are lit to keep the afflicted visible after sunset, their shadows stretching along the walls like grotesque marionettes. Sleep offers no mercy. Many rise after only a few hours collapse and resume the same urgent movement, as though driven by an unfinished task. Spectators have grown accustomed to the strange pageant. They bring benches, shaded awnings, even snacks, uneasy picnics set against the backdrop of human endurance unraveling. There is talk of wagers, how long a certain dancer can last before collapsing, who will outlast whom. If the scene resembles a festival, it is one stripped of joy. Some physicians stand in the crowd, taking notes. They speak of overheated blood, of humours thrown into imbalance by the season. The term choreomania appears in marginal scribbles, but offers no cure. Others reach for scripture, declaring the plague an act of divine judgment or demonic influence. Neither explanation slows the steps. The afflicted are not confined to one square. Dancing erupts in side streets, in the courtyards of guild halls, even on the steps of the cathedral. The city's rhythm has changed. Bells still toll the hours, but they are answered by the shuffle and stamp of feet that refuse to rest. From a distance, the movement can seem almost synchronized, like an elaborate civic ritual. Up close, the disarray is obvious. Some sway as if in prayer, others jerk violently. Some seem to be running in place against an invisible wind. Conversations between dancers are rare. Most seem locked inward, unreachable. Collapse is the only interruption. Heat, exhaustion, and strain claim their toll. A few never rise again, their final moments spent in motion. Chroniclers note deaths from heart failure and stroke, though these are recorded with the same dispassion as a merchant's ledger. The city grieves quietly, but the steps continue around the fallen. Rumors of contagion spread faster than any official proclamation. In nearby towns, people bar their gates to travelers from Strasbourg. Traders whisper that the very sight of the afflicted is dangerous, that to watch too long is to be drawn in. Some citizens avert their eyes entirely, navigating the streets without looking at what passes beside them. By late August, the number of dancers has peaked. Public spaces are choked with bodies, and yet the phenomenon shows no sign of burning out. The authorities begin to recognize the scale of the crisis, though not, perhaps, its nature. In the face of a city losing control of its own limbs, they will turn to solutions as strange as the affliction itself. The summer heat lingers, the dancers still move, and beneath the growing desperation of the crowd, a quieter fear begins to take root. If the cause cannot be seen, named, or touched, perhaps it cannot be stopped at all. The first official meeting to address the crisis takes place not in some shadowed council chamber, but in full daylight, under the open arcades of the city hall. The mayor, several aldermen, and a small contingent of physicians stand in a loose semicircle, trying to talk over the muffled percussion of feet striking stone just beyond the square. It is an unusual soundtrack for civic governance. The doctors speak first. Their conclusion, rendered with the assurance of men whose trade relies on confident explanations, is that the dancers are suffering from an overheated blood disorder, a kind of dancing fever brought on by excessive heat and humoral imbalance. The cure, they declare, is simple. Let the body work the fever out. In other words, more dancing. It is a decision that seems oddly tidy. There will be no quarantines, no calls for stillness or isolation. Instead, the afflicted are to be given space, music, and encouragement to keep moving until the fever burns itself away. The city's leaders nod, perhaps relieved to have an action that requires no direct confrontation with the supernatural or the unknown. Within days, Strasbourg begins an unprecedented civic project, the repurposing of public buildings into dance halls. The grain market is cleared of its stalls. Guild halls are swept, benches removed, and floors polished smooth. Strong, able-bodied men are hired to keep the dancers upright should they falter. If a participant slows, they are lifted, steadied, and urged back into motion. Musicians are brought in at public expense. Fiddlers, drummers, and pipers, all under municipal contract, are stationed in rotation to provide a steady, relentless beat. The idea, according to one official memorandum, is to facilitate the cure through rhythm and vigor. If this logic seems tenuous, it is not remarked upon in the city's records. To manage the crowds, the council imposes a loose schedule. Certain streets are designated dance lanes, marked with chalk to guide the flow of bodies. A few enterprising vendors even set up stalls selling watered wine and bread to spectators, their earnings a quiet side effect of municipal policy. Somewhere between ordinance and performance, Strasbourg has accidentally staged its own grim festival. Not everyone is convinced. Some clergy protest that the remedy encourages sin, citing the indecorum of men and women swaying together in public without cause. Others argue that the music will not drive the affliction out, but deeper in. Their objections are formally recorded and politely ignored. The council's plan continues. The results are mixed. Some dancers collapse entirely within hours of the new measures, carried away by relatives or strangers. Others seem only to intensify, their movements growing sharper and more urgent under the influence of the drums. Spectators note that the musicians sometimes quicken their tempo, as though egging the dancers on, whether intentionally or out of habit is unclear. In the council's minutes, there is no sign of second guessing. The policy is reaffirmed week after week, even as the number of afflicted holds steady. If anything, the The authorities interpret the persistence of the mania as proof that the cure has not yet run its full course, rather than evidence of its failure. There is a certain bureaucratic comfort in this reasoning. The cause is named, the treatment is underway, the system is functioning exactly as designed. That it is producing no visible improvement seems almost irrelevant. Medieval governance, like the machinery of a great clock, prefers to keep moving rather than admit its hands might point to the wrong hour. By early September, the dance lanes have worn grooves into the cobblestones, and the guild halls smell of stale sweat and candle wax. The music, once bright, has grown monotonous. Its rhythms blurred into a kind of mechanical hum in the minds of those who hear it daily. A few musicians quietly request reassignment to other duties. Still, the city persists. For the council, stopping the program now would be to admit misjudgment, a risk to civic authority as dangerous as the mania itself. And so the dancers are kept in motion, the music kept playing, and Strasbourg's streets echo with the sound of a cure that may be indistinguishable from the disease. Under the same summer sun that baked the cobblestones of Strasbourg's market square, the surrounding countryside had been enduring a far slower, less visible strain. For several years, the Rhine Valley had been caught in a cycle of extremes. Wet springs that rotted seed in the soil, followed by dry seasons that cracked the earth before harvest. The city's granaries were never quite empty, but neither were they comfortably full. Hunger did not arrive all at once. It crept in the form of smaller loaves, thinner stews, and the quiet habit of counting one's remaining coins before deciding on supper. The winters had been no kinder. Some were marked by sudden freezes that split river ice like brittle glass. Others dragged on damp and grey, refusing to yield to spring. Firewood prices climbed as forests were picked clean of easy timber. And even the better-off households kept to fewer rooms, closing off spaces they could not afford to heat. Cold seeped into joints and tempers alike. When famine or plague was spoken of, it was no longer as a distant calamity in another province, but as something that might easily arrive on the next market day. Disease, when it came, travelled faster than the frost. Infections spread along the trade routes, riverboats, merchant carts, and the boots of peddlers. Some years brought fevers that burned out quickly. Others carried sicknesses that lingered, passing from home to home like unwelcome visitors who refused to leave. Mortality was not constant, but the fear of it was. Each illness left behind not only graves, but empty chairs in workshops and fields left untilled. Against this background, the city's population grew more tightly wound. Strasbourg's markets bustled, but a watchful edge had crept into daily exchange. Haggling became sharper, not out of greed, but from the simple arithmetic of survival. Guild rules that once ensured fair practice now served as fragile barriers against collapse. Even the cathedral's towering spire, a symbol of permanence, had weathered its share of repairs from storms that no longer felt exceptional. The burdens were not evenly shared. Wealthier burghers could cushion poor harvests with stored grain and imported goods. The poorer households, many already carrying debts to the same burghers, felt each shortage more keenly. Bread riots were rare but never unimaginable. In such a climate, charity was both an act of piety and a subtle means of maintaining social order, a public reminder that the hand giving alms was also the one setting the price of flour. Religious life, too, reflected the strain. Processions for rain or for its cessation wound through the streets in years when weather turned capricious. Saints whose patronage had once seemed symbolic were petitioned in earnest. Saint Vitus, Saint Roch, Saint Sebastian. Their images were carried aloft in hopes of diverting sickness or restoring crops. Faith offered both explanation and insurance. Though the premiums were paid in candle wax, incense, and the occasional indulgence. It was also a city of refugees. The wars of neighbouring states and the skirmishes of the Holy Roman Empire pushed families to seek safety within Strasbourg's walls. They brought skills, stories, and sometimes news of calamities worse than the city's own. news that could serve as either warning or reassurance, depending on the listener's temperament. But more mouths meant greater demand on already strained stores, and not every arrival was welcomed without calculation. Economic life, while outwardly steady, was quietly brittle. Strasbourg's position on the Rhine made it a hub for trade, but that same reliance on commerce meant the city's fortunes were tied to the health of routes beyond its control. A bad year in the Low Countries or the Black Forest could ripple into shortages at home. The rhythms of the market bell, signalling open and close each day, became as much a measure of collective anxiety as of commerce. When the weather was fair and the harvests tolerable, these pressures could fade into the background hum of urban life. But they never fully vanished. They lingered like smoke in the rafters, waiting for the next spark. People adjusted by becoming practiced at small endurance, saving a little more flour, mending clothes rather than replacing them, passing down habits of frugality as carefully as they did family heirlooms. It is within such a landscape, neither catastrophe nor comfort, but a long, narrowing corridor of difficulty, that the events of the summer of 1518 would take shape. A city already accustomed to managing shortages and uncertainties was about to encounter a crisis that could not be measured in sacks of grain or days of frost. The same systems that had weathered storms and sickness would now face something far less tangible, yet no less disruptive. In hindsight, it is tempting to see the dancing mania as an abrupt eruption into an otherwise stable scene. But stability in Strasbourg was a matter of balance, not abundance. The line between order and unrest was thinner than it appeared. What the city called resilience might just as easily be read as exhaustion, the kind that, when pushed, does not break immediately, but warps in strange and unpredictable ways. And so, in the weeks before Frau Trophier's first steps in the marketplace, Strasbourg was a city holding its breath. The stores of grain were adequate but not generous. The summer sun was warm but not yet oppressive. No one could name a single reason to expect upheaval, yet the air itself seemed to carry the tension of a rope drawn taut, waiting for the smallest, most unlikely tug to set it quivering. The suspicion began quietly, as such things often do. A few murmured comparisons between the dancers' strange movements and the wild thrashing of livestock that had eaten spoiled feed. Then, somewhere between the physician's formal diagnoses and the clergy's spiritual warnings, the theory took a sharper shape: the rye. More precisely, what might be hiding in it. In good years, rye was a sturdy, dependable crop, resistant to poor soil, forgiving of cold, and a staple in the poorer districts where wheat was too costly. In bad years, however, it could conceal a less welcome growth: the dark, horn-shaped sclerotia of Claviceps purpurea, known to farmers and herbalists alike as ergot. Consumed in bread or porridge, ergot could bring on burning sensations in the limbs, convulsions, hallucinations, and, in more severe cases, the slow, blackening death of gangrene. To a society without microscopes, it was a plague that seemed to spring from the grain itself, as if the devil had claimed a tithe in the fields. The idea was not new. Records from other parts of Europe had blamed St. Anthony's fire, as ergotism was often called, for outbreaks of strange visions and contorted movements. In those cases, the culprit was sometimes traced to a particular mill or baker, whose flour bore the fungus's bitter, metallic taste. The Strasbourg affliction, however, did not fit the older patterns so neatly. There was no sudden spike in amputations, no widespread burning pain in the limbs, and while some of the dancers displayed jerking, spasmodic motions, their affliction carried them on for days, far longer than the intense, short-lived seizures typical of ergot poisoning. Still, the grain remained under suspicion. It was, after all, the one thing nearly everyone consumed daily, regardless of station. Some townsfolk swore they could taste a difference in the bread that summer, a faint sharpness, a tang on the tongue that wasn't there before. Bakers, faced with declining sales, insisted their flour was clean and their ovens blameless. Yet even they admitted that the rye harvest from the surrounding countryside had been poor, and poorer harvests meant less choosiness in what was ground into meal. Physicians, bound more to humoral theory than to fungal botany, offered mixed opinions. Some argued that a tainted diet could certainly overheat the blood and unsettle the humours, setting the stage for feverish activity. Others countered that, if the bread were truly to blame, the affliction would be wider still, striking not just dozens in the marketplace, but hundreds in their homes. And, they pointed out, the dancers were often able to eat and drink between their bouts, hardly the behaviour of those in the grip of severe poisoning. Outside the city's records, rumours travelled faster than evidence. In the countryside, it was whispered that the grain merchants had knowingly sold tainted rye to the poor while keeping clean stocks for their own tables. In taverns, the speculation grew more lurid. The devil himself had walked the fields in spring, seeding the ears with his own dark gifts. Some said the dancers were not afflicted by illness at all, but were vessels for the unholy banquet of that harvest, their bodies writhing to rhythms only he could play. The authorities did not launch an official inquiry into the grain supply, perhaps because the idea could not be disproven without implicating too many reputable tradesmen. Instead, the theory was allowed to hover at the edges of the crisis, invoked when convenient and ignored when not. It offered a tangible villain for those who needed one, and a plausible excuse for those unwilling to venture into more supernatural explanations. Yet, there was something unsatisfying about it. Even among those willing to blame the rye, few could explain why the affliction struck in such a concentrated form, a knot of bodies in the heart of the city, as if summoned to one place. Ergotism could account for confusion, convulsions, and visions, but not the unbroken persistence of movement, nor the eerie synchrony of so many victims. The bread might have set the stage, but it seemed an unlikely choreographer. In modern accounts, ergot poisoning would remain one of the more persistent hypotheses, in part because it offered a scientific foothold on terrain otherwise cluttered with saints, demons, and humoral imbalance. It was easier to speak of mouldy grain than to map the interior weather of a mind carried beyond its own will. But even in the 16th century, the better observers could sense that if the grain was guilty, it was guilty only as an accomplice. Perhaps the most telling detail is this. When the mania finally passed, no special measures were taken with the rye. The bakers returned to their work, the millstones turned as before, and the same fields were sown the next spring. Whatever had moved through Strasbourg that summer, it had not been stopped by a change in diet. And so, the devil in the grain, if he was there at all, went back to waiting in the furrows, unbothered by the brief attention. The theory would endure nonetheless, folded into the lore of the event like a note slipped between the pages of a book. For some, it was the simplest explanation. For others, it was a reminder that the smallest of things, a seed, a spore, a shadow on a stalk of rye, could carry within it the power to unbalance an entire city. And in Strasbourg, that summer, balance had been fragile enough to tip. The stories rarely appeared in the city's official records. Instead, they trickled in through travellers' accounts, letters between monasteries, and the gossip of visiting merchants. In these accounts, convents across the region were said to have taken sudden, strange turns, nuns abandoning their hymns for sharp, guttural mews, processions dissolving into fits of biting, shrieking, or frantic leaps. The details varied with the teller, but the image remained constant. A cloistered space, once ordered and serene, suddenly given over to chaos that seemed both spontaneous and unstoppable. Some chroniclers dismissed these episodes as exaggerations, the inevitable embroidery of idle tongues. Others recorded them with the same tone used for storms or fires, as unfortunate events, disruptive but not inexplicable. The notion that sacred spaces could become stages for such behavior was unsettling, yet oddly familiar. In a time when the body was viewed as a vessel for obedience, both spiritual and social, there was a certain inevitability in its eventual refusal. Life inside a convent was disciplined by design. Bells dictated the day's rhythm, waking, praying, eating, working, sleeping. Meals were plain, speech was regulated, movement confined. For most, This was a chosen path of devotion. For others, it was chosen on their behalf. A younger daughter without a dowry, a widow without prospects, a girl whose family sought the security of vows in place of marriage. In such cases, the cloister's silence could carry an edge of captivity. The meowing nuns, whether literal or metaphorical, seemed to embody the pressure of that silence. To break into sound, not in prayer but in animal mimicry, was to fracture the boundaries that defined the self within those walls. The act was shocking precisely because it lacked refinement. No one could claim it was inspired by divine rapture. It was unashamedly of the body, unmeasured, and therefore beyond the convent's sanctioned order. In Strasbourg and its neighbouring towns, these stories found ready listeners. The dancing mania unfolding in the streets shared a certain family resemblance with such cloistered rebellions. In both, the body took command, defying the decorum expected of its station. The parallel did not go unnoticed by the clergy, some of whom used it as a cautionary example. Unbridled movement, they warned, could unseat reason and invite spiritual peril. Others saw in it something more ambiguous. Pilgrims spoke of nuns who claimed their outbursts were not madness, but compulsion, a force that seized them without consent, leaving them exhausted but strangely lighter, as if some inward weight had been shifted. In the marketplace, similar language began to creep into descriptions of the dancers. They were not always framed as sinners or fools, but as people overtaken by a power too strong for mere will to resist. Ritual, in its sanctioned form, offered a controlled outlet for such impulses. Processions, pilgrimages, fasts, and feasts all allowed the body to participate in worship. But when ritual was compressed under too much order, when its movements were prescribed too tightly, it could warp, bending into shapes unrecognizable to its keepers. A march might turn into a dance, a chant might dissolve into mewing, devotion might collapse into something resembling delirium. For the authorities, both civil and ecclesiastical, such eruptions posed a problem. To admit they were acts of rebellion was to risk acknowledging that their systems of control were imperfect. To dismiss them as mere illness was safer. It kept the matter in the realm of treatment, not critique. Thus, the same pattern emerged as with the dancers. Diagnoses were issued, remedies applied, and the deeper questions politely avoided. The faithful, however, were not so quick to separate the sacred from the strange. In sermons and whispered conversations alike, some wondered whether the body's refusal to remain still was itself a kind of divine message, a warning against excess, or a summons to change. Others, more wary, saw only temptation and disorder, the creeping hand of the devil using flesh as his instrument. As with the grain, the truth proved elusive. The convent tales may have been isolated, exaggerated, or entirely allegorical. But their endurance in the city's memory suggests they served a purpose. They gave shape to a fear that life lived too tightly bound could, without warning, tear its own seams. By the summer of 1518, Strasbourg's streets were seeing that image writ large. Where the cloister's rebellion had been contained behind stone walls, the marketplace now hosted its own public liturgy of ungovernable motion. The dancers, like the meowing nuns, were reminders that the body, no matter how disciplined, no matter how devout, could be coaxed or driven into strange, unorthodox rituals all its own. And once begun, such rituals were not easily stopped. In the summer of 1518, Strasbourg's skyline was a geometry of faith and commerce. The cathedral rose above the rooftops, its single spire needling the clouds, a work of stone that seemed more delicate than its size allowed. Narrow streets twisted between timber-framed houses, their upper floors leaning toward each other like neighbors sharing secrets. The smell of baking bread drifted from low arched doorways, mingling with the sharper tang of tanners' vats by the river. The Ill River curled lazily through the city, its waters carrying barges laden with wine casks, sacks of grain, and the occasional, suspiciously heavy chest bound for the tax collector's office. On its banks, merchants haggled invoices that carried across the water, the rhythm of their trade as much a part of the city's life as the tolling of bells. From the bridges, a visitor could watch the daily traffic of carts and porters threading between stalls that seemed always one customer away from a quarrel. Strasbourg was no minor outpost. As a free imperial city within the Holy Roman Empire, it enjoyed a measure of autonomy that brought both prosperity and a constant undercurrent of political maneuvering. The city council, a blend of patrician families and guild representatives, met in chambers panelled with carved oak, where the weight of the emperor's distant authority was felt most in the seal on their charters. Decisions were made slowly, and usually only after every possible party had been consulted or exhausted. Beneath this official order, life was a layering of smaller worlds. The guild halls stood like fortresses of their trades. Coopers, bakers, weavers, and butchers, each guarding the privileges they had spent decades securing. Apprentices fetched water, carried tools, and absorbed the whispered rules not written in any charter. On feast days, these same men and boys spilled into the streets in bright livery, their banners catching the light, a reminder that even industry had its ceremonial face. In the poorer quarters, the cobblestones gave way to beaten earth. Here, the city's order was more porous, and its smells more persuasive. Smoke from low hearths, sour beer brewing in small casks, refuse left too long at the edge of the lane. Families crowded into narrow rooms, sharing space with the tools of their trade. A smith's children might sleep beside the forge. A seamstress's bed might be pressed under a line of drying cloth. It was not poverty so much as a different economy of space and comfort. Above all, Strasbourg was a city of rhythms. Bells marked the hours not just for prayer, but for commerce, for the locking of gates, for the end of a market day. The cathedral's great clock, an elaborate contraption of painted figures and mechanical chimes, presided over the passing of time with a precision that the city itself rarely matched. Festivals broke this order, scattering the streets with music, banners, and food stalls until the next dawn's bells restored the usual patterns. Faith wove itself into every tier of this life. Shrines stood at street corners, their painted saints watching over both solemn processions and the far less solemn business of haggling over fish prices. Pilgrims passed through on their way to more distant holy sites, leaving behind coins, relics of dubious provenance, and the occasional story too strange to forget. Churches and monasteries offered charity in measured quantities, balancing mercy with the need to maintain discipline. The city's prosperity, however, rested on less visible foundations. Strasbourg was a trading hub because its roads and river routes connected it to the Rhineland, to Switzerland, and to the markets of France. Grain, wine, salt, and cloth moved through its warehouses, taxed at every stage. The wealth this brought was unevenly spread, but it kept the civic machine turning. In good years, there was enough to fund repairs to the cathedral's masonry or commission a new altarpiece. In lean years, the same wealth seemed to vanish into debts and defensive walls. Recent decades had been marked by both. Floods had tested the city's defenses, harsh winters had thinned grain stores, and rumours of war along the empire's borders had a way of reaching the market square faster than official proclamations. Yet daily life continued, as it always did, within the bounds of what people could afford to notice. The council kept records of every levy collected, every dispute settled, though rarely of the mood of the streets. By midsummer, the air was thick with heat, and the scents it amplified: the warm musk of livestock, the sour tang from the tanner's quarter, the faint sweetness of fruit ripening too quickly in the Sunday. The marketplace was loud, with voices calling over one another, the sound occasionally pierced by the bray of a stubborn mule or the clang of a dropped ladle. Musicians played at the edges, their tunes competing with the cries of vendors hawking bread, cheese, and bolts of cloth. It was a place of careful balance. The city's laws dictated the weight of loaves, the hours of labour, the quality of goods sold, and the penalties for breaking these rules. At the same time, unwritten customs shaped what could be said, bought, or done without attracting attention. Strasbourg's public life relied on 1,000 small agreements, many of them so old that no one could remember their origin. They held the city together until they didn't. Looking back, nothing in these days before the frenzy suggested that anything was about to shift. There was heat, there was trade, there was the usual mix of contentment and complaint. The council was occupied with questions of grain tariffs and bridge repairs, the clergy with arranging the next procession of relics. The cathedral bells rang out as they always had. The streets were full, but not yet moving to any rhythm beyond their own. And yet, beneath the measured pace, the city was as vulnerable as any tightly wound machine. One irregular motion, one unplanned step, could ripple outward, changing the rhythm entirely. Strasbourg did not know it, but it was already only days away from the first beat. Faith in Strasbourg was not simply a matter of church attendance. It was the grammar by which the city spoke to itself, the framework into which both blessings and misfortunes were fitted. Illness, good harvests, sudden storms, all were read as part of a correspondence between the divine and the mortal, a dialogue that never truly ceased. Among the afflictions recognized by the faithful, the so-called St. Vitus's dance occupied an uneasy place. It was neither wholly disease nor entirely moral failing, but something in between, an intrusion of the sacred into the flesh, urgent and disorienting. Those overtaken might jerk, twist, or sway as though seized by invisible hands. The movement could be taken as a sign of devotion, a penance, or a punishment, depending on who interpreted it. Pilgrimages offered the most accepted remedy. Sufferers, sometimes bound in red cloth, were led to shrines dedicated to St. Vitus or St. John. There, prayers and masses were offered for their release. The colour red was thought to calm the affliction, perhaps by pleasing the saint, perhaps by confusing the devil. In either case, the logic was internally consistent, and that was enough to make it binding. These rituals were not mere superstition in the eyes of the time. They were structured acts, sanctioned by the church, performed in a sequence as deliberate as any legal proceeding. Just as a contract required signatures and seals, a cure required the right relics, the right prayers, and the correct journey, all carried out under the supervision of those with the proper authority. The fear that underpinned such faith was equally formalized. To misdiagnose an affliction was to risk not only a wasted cure but the anger of heaven. Illnesses might be earthly, but they could also be spiritual in origin, their symptoms no less real for having been summoned by sin. A wrong remedy could deepen the offense, turning a warning into a sentence. It was in this atmosphere that the dancing of 1518 would be read. The spectacle of bodies moving without rest had precedence in the chronicles. In earlier decades, similar outbreaks had driven pilgrims in ragged processions to chapels along the Rhine, their movements as much a part of the cure as the prayers said on arrival. To stop prematurely was to invite relapse, or worse. Public ritual was the visible face of this belief. Processions carried relics through the streets not only to bless the city but to ward off what might already be working its way toward it. Crosses were hung above doors, candles burned before statues whose paint had long since darkened with smoke. Each act was both a declaration of loyalty and a preemptive defense. Yet these defenses were porous. The same faith that could draw the afflicted toward order could also be a conduit for panic. A rumor of divine displeasure could move faster than any official edict, shaping behavior in the market before the council even knew of it. In such moments, the rituals themselves could take on an edge of frenzy, a rush to complete them before the unseen danger grew too near. The clergy walked a narrow line between reassuring the populace and reinforcing its fears. To downplay a threat risked being seen as negligent. To magnify it risked inviting the very unrest they wished to contain. Their sermons balanced scripture with practical instruction, the two woven together until it was difficult to tell which served as foundation for the other. In Strasbourg, fear and ritual did not merely coexist, they relied upon each other. Fear gave ritual urgency, ritual gave fear a shape. This reciprocal bond meant that the city's collective response to any disturbance was already scripted. The actors might change, but the gestures, the prayers, and the processions would follow familiar lines. And so, when the first dancers stepped into the summer streets, they did not appear to be breaking the order entirely. In some eyes, they were participants in a kind of involuntary rite, one that might yet be brought back within the sanctioned forms. That it was happening without a priest's blessing or a saint's relic was troubling, but the movement itself was not alien. The question was whether this was an act begun in heaven, in hell, or in the human body alone. Strasbourg's people did not yet agree on the answer, but they knew, instinctively, that the next step would belong to the city's guardians of both faith and order. It began quietly, or as quietly as dozens of pounding feet can begin. The marketplace was full, the midsummer sun flattening the shadows, the air carrying the mingled scents of bread ovens and horse dung. A few onlookers paused to watch, thinking perhaps it was a rehearsal for a festival, or the work of a troupe passing through. But the dancers did not stop at the end of a song, because there was no song. Within hours, the rhythm of the market fractured. Stalls that had held neat piles of fruit or bolts of cloth stood abandoned, the goods left to the heat. Conversations faltered mid-bargain, as the crowd's attention was drawn to the figures moving with relentless momentum, their faces set, eyes unfocused. A mother tugged her child behind her skirts, not out of fear of violence, but from the disquiet of seeing bodies moving as if possessed by a single will none of them had chosen. The city's usual methods of restoring order were ill-suited to the scene. The constables could disperse a brawl or close a tavern, but here there was nothing to command, no shouting, no defiance, only the ceaseless motion. The dancers did not answer questions, did not seem to notice when the council's men tried to block their way. If touched, they turned, stepped around, and continued, as if water flowing past a rock. By the second day, more had joined. Some came unwillingly, drawn in by proximity, their steps beginning as mimicry and ending as compulsion. Others, watching from the safety of a shaded doorway, swore later that they could feel a pull in their own limbs, a restlessness that was easier to ignore if they looked away. The city had seen processions before, but this was no ordered file. It spilled through the streets without destination, changing direction as if guided by an unseen conductor. Merchants complained to the council about lost business. The clergy worried aloud in sermons about contagion of the soul. In both cases, the anxiety was the same, that something was moving through the city outside the sanctioned forms, ignoring the boundaries that gave Strasbourg its shape. The council's records note meetings, discussions, and consultations with physicians. But even in their tidy script, there is the sense of a problem already slipping out of their grasp. The music came soon after. If the movement could not be stopped, perhaps it could be contained, channeled into a safer course. Musicians were brought in, their task not to inspire, but to exhaust, to give the dancers a frame in which to finish themselves. It was a remedy of a sort, though one that depended on the same motion it sought to end. The logic was not unfamiliar. It was how fevers were treated, by drawing them out until they burned away. Instead, the music became another lure. The dancers' steps fell into its patterns, and more onlookers found themselves moving, first in time, then without choice. Guild halls were cleared to house the afflicted, their cool interiors echoing with the scrape of feet on wooden floors. The city's orderly spaces were becoming stages, though no one had agreed to the performance. The effect on daily life was cumulative. Markets thinned, workshops slowed, and the watch was forced to patrol not for thieves or brawlers, but for clusters of dancers blocking the narrow streets. Pilgrims arriving from the countryside were greeted not by the solemn majesty of the cathedral, but by this restless choreography. Rumours began to spread beyond the walls, carrying the news in tones that varied from awe to ridicule. As the days lengthened, the distinctions between the afflicted and the curious grew hazy. Some claimed to be victims, others claimed they were only imitating, though even they sometimes forgot when to stop. Neighbours began avoiding one another's eyes in the street, unwilling to risk the suggestion that a shared glance might be enough to start them moving. The clergy's processions, once intended to bless the city, now risked being overtaken by it. A relic borne through the square might find itself surrounded by dancers. The solemn chant tangled with the beat of drums meant for another purpose. The boundaries between ritual and outbreak blurred until neither could be easily separated from the other. For all its absurdity, the spectacle was not without menace. The city's balance depended on predictable rhythms, of work, of worship, of trade. The dance disrupted each in turn, not through malice, but through persistence. Every hour it continued was another hour in which the city was reminded that control could be eroded without a single stone falling from its walls. By the height of summer, Strasbourg's streets had ceased to belong entirely to those who walked them by choice. The dancers' movements, unpredictable yet constant, became a new kind of clock, one that did not mark the hour, but the city's slow drift from order into something less certain. No decree or sermon had yet found a way to halt it. The next attempt would take a different shape, one aimed at ending the motion by sending it away entirely. The change, when it came, was almost imperceptible. The heat of late August softened into cooler air, and the dancers' numbers began, slowly, to thin. In the marketplace, where once whole knots of bodies had swayed and stamped, there were now only a few, like embers that had fallen from a larger fire. Passers-by noticed the quiet, not as relief at first, but as an unfamiliar absence, like a room whose constant ticking clock had stopped. No proclamation declared the end. There was no moment where the council could announce that the city was cured. Instead, the dancers seemed to slip away. Some collapsing into stillness where they stood, others vanishing into the side streets, carried along by family or by those sent for the purpose. The soundscape shifted. The scrape of leather soles on stone gave way again to the more familiar calls of traders and the clatter of carts. But the air held the faint echo of a rhythm that had been impossible to ignore for weeks. It was in this lull that the council's chosen remedy revealed its final act. Pilgrimages were organized to the shrine of St. Vitus in Saverne and to other holy sites thought to have authority over the malady. The afflicted, still unsteady, were led or carried along the roads, some bound in cloth to keep their movements contained. The journeys were not brief. They were meant to wear down what remained of the compulsion, to let distance and ritual act together as a cure. The roads themselves became processional stages. Villagers along the way stopped to watch as the odd columns passed. Pale, sweating figures flanked by escorts, some murmuring prayers, others silent as though conserving strength. For the attendants, the act of guiding them was as much symbolic as practical. Each step toward the shrine was both a plea and a performance of resolve, a way to turn an inexplicable disorder into a pilgrimage of meaning. At the shrines, offerings were made. Coins, candles, small carvings of feet or legs in wood or wax, each left in hope of divine intervention. The afflicted were blessed, sprinkled with holy water, and urged to touch relics said to hold the saints' intercession. To some, these rituals brought visible calm. To others, they seemed simply to mark the moment when the journey ended and the long walk back could begin. Back in Strasbourg, the spaces once commandeered for the dancing began to revert. Guild halls were swept, their floors scrubbed to remove the scuffs and stains of weeks of constant motion. Musicians, whose services had been requisitioned by the council, quietly returned to playing in taverns and weddings, where music was again voluntary. The city's scribes recorded expenses for transport and alms, and then moved on to the next matters of trade and governance, their ink lines making no note of the strangeness that had filled the summer. The clergy, in sermons, treated the dissipation as a moral lesson fulfilled. Whatever had provoked the outbreak, sin, punishment, or a failure of devotion, had been answered through pilgrimage and prayer. The explanation was tidy, even if no one could agree on the cause. It allowed the city to frame the episode as concluded, an event with a beginning and an end, despite the fact that both had been blurred. For the citizens who had watched it from doorways or stalls, the ending was less a moral resolution than a gradual forgetting. Faces that had been familiar in the crowd of dancers were now seen in more ordinary settings, at market stalls, at wells, at mass. Yet some retained an odd gait, a lingering tremor, as if the body had not quite remembered how to be still. Those traces drew less attention each day, until they, too, slipped from notice. The heat that had accompanied the worst of it broke with the season. By September, the wind carried a cooler scent over the river, and the market square no longer shimmered with the oppressive weight of midsummer. People began to speak of the harvest again, of river tolls and winter fuel, subjects comfortably within the reach of ordinary control. Even so, certain corners of the city retained a faint charge for those who had seen them transformed. A patch of cobblestones in the grain market, a stretch of street by the tanner's quarter, places where the sound of feet had been unbroken for hours or days, now seemed different, though nothing marked them. Some residents avoided those spots without knowing why. Others lingered there a moment longer than necessary, as if listening for a sound they half expected to return. The council, in its records, made no proclamation of success. The final entries are sparse. The tally of pilgrims sent, the names of those who failed to return, the closing of accounts for hired musicians and strongmen. The handwriting is the same as before, the pen strokes no more hurried or hesitant. It is the kind of bureaucratic neatness that both preserves and erases the strangeness of events, leaving them as lines of cost and inventory. By autumn, the city had resumed its usual tempo. The dance had not been driven out so much as allowed to run down, like a clock that had been left to unwind. There was no assurance it would not return. But for the moment, Strasbourg's streets belonged again to those who chose to walk them, and the air no longer pulsed with the compulsion to move without end. Centuries have a way of turning calamity into curiosity. The Strasbourg outbreak did not remain an isolated mystery in the archives. It found its place among a broader family of afflictions that medieval Europe seemed able to produce without effort. Long before 1518, and for more than a century afterward, reports of mass involuntary dancing appeared in scattered towns along the Rhine, in the Low Countries, and as far south as the Italian peninsula. Each had its own local flavour, yet the pattern was familiar. Bodies seized by movement, crowds swelling, authorities bewildered. Chroniclers recorded earlier incidents with the same blend of bafflement and resignation. In Aachen, in 1374, entire groups were said to have danced in bridges and churchyards until they collapsed. Some wore garlands, others clutched at each other's arms, not for companionship but to keep themselves upright. The episodes often drew processions to nearby chapels dedicated to Saint Vitus or Saint John, saints whose patronage seemed to extend into this strange domain of uncontrolled motion. In Italy, a similar phenomenon acquired a different name, tarantism, tied to the belief that the bite of a tarantula or wolf spider could be cured only through frenzied dancing. There, the music was deliberate from the start, tailored to draw out the poison. The steps could vary, some slow and measured, others wild and abrupt. But the goal was the same, to move until the body declared itself free. Whether the spider was real or imagined mattered less than the shared conviction that this was the proper cure. The records of these outbreaks suggest a Europe in which the line between illness and ritual was porous. Movement could be both symptom and medicine. Music could be balm or contagion. The same drum beat that steadied a soldier's march could, in the wrong context, unmoor a crowd. This ambiguity made such events difficult to categorize and therefore difficult to prevent. Theories have multiplied in the centuries since. Some point to ergot poisoning, that old suspect in Strasbourg's case, which can cause convulsions and hallucinations. Others note the psychological toll of famine, plague, and war, a constant undercurrent of strain that might find release in collective physical expression. But these explanations, while plausible in part, do not account for the endurance of the outbreaks or for the way they could travel across regions and decades. The persistence of dancing manias in different cultures suggests they were as much social events as medical ones. They gathered spectators, drew commentary from clergy and council alike, and left behind enough written traces to be remembered. In some places, the dance itself became formalized, stripped of its menace, and folded into seasonal festivals, as if taming it through repetition. In others, the memory alone was enough to prompt caution when music and movement converged too freely. Authorities in later centuries approached similar outbreaks with mixed methods. Some banned public dancing entirely, fearing a repeat. Others leaned into the old cures, hiring musicians and setting aside halls, perhaps remembering Strasbourg's example, though not always recognizing its irony. In both cases, the solutions revealed as much about civic order as they did about the affliction itself. For positions of the early modern period, these manias became case studies, though the conclusions were often couched in moral language. Excessive mirth, spiritual laxity, or an imbalance of humours might all be invoked. A few ventured into more speculative territory, suggesting the dances were forms of contagious imagination, where the mind caught what the body performed. Even as the events grew rarer by the 18th century, they lingered in scholarly and popular memory. Antiquarians collected reports, poets turned them into allegories, and painters captured imagined scenes of whirling figures under summer skies. In each retelling, the tension between the absurd and the dangerous remained intact, refusing to resolve neatly into one or the other. To modern eyes, these outbreaks appear as strange collisions of belief, physiology, and circumstance. They are reminders that mass events need not be orderly to be powerful, and that a community can be drawn into action without clear cause or endpoint. The people who danced in Strasbourg were not the last to find themselves moving to a rhythm no one could name. The legacy of these manias lies not only in their recurrence, but in the way they exposed the fragility of civic order. A city could be fortified against armies, its gates closed against plague, yet still find itself undone by something as intangible as a compulsion to dance. In that sense, the epidemics were not merely medical anomalies, they were civic stress tests, revealing what lay beneath the surface of law and custom. In the quieter centuries that followed, Europe saw fewer such outbreaks. But the stories remained, carried in chronicles and sermons, ready to be recalled whenever a crowd moved strangely, or a tune lingered too long in the air. Strasbourg's summer of 1518 had joined a long, uneven line of strange epidemics, each a reminder that sometimes history's most persistent contagions are those that travel not in the body alone, but in the shared imagination. The summer of 1518 did not leave Strasbourg with monuments or plaques. It left, instead, a residue, intangible yet persistent, of decisions that seemed, in retrospect, to belong more to a theatre troupe than a governing council. Among these, none was more curious than the choice to treat involuntary dancing with more dancing. The logic, at the time, had a certain symmetry. If movement was the illness, perhaps it was also the cure. What this overlooked was the small but crucial fact that the dancers could not stop on their own. The hiring of musicians became, in later tellings, the detail that clung most stubbornly to the story. Drummers, pipers, and fiddlers were summoned not to accompany a festival or procession, but to stand in guild halls and marketplaces, playing tirelessly to an audience who had not bought tickets and could not leave. Their wages were duly recorded, their service noted with the same precision as if they had been repairing the city walls. Equally enduring was the matter of the shoes. Crosses painted or stitched onto the tops were meant to protect the wearer from St. Vitus's influence, an act of both faith and craftsmanship. For a time, shoemakers found themselves producing these talismans in unusual quantity, a brief surge in trade caused by a spiritual precaution. That few of the dancers seemed to benefit did little to dampen the practice. The appearance of protection was, in its own way, a civic duty. The council's instructions to house the afflicted in specific halls, to clear spaces for them, to keep them moving under watch. These too have an air of methodical absurdity. In the logic of municipal order, it was better to confine the unpredictable within walls than to let it spill unchecked into the streets, even if those walls only echoed the sound. The effect was rather like trying to contain a flood, by building a reservoir directly in the town square. In the city's records, these measures are laid out with no hint of irony. Expenses were tallied, dates and names entered. It is only from the vantage of later centuries that the contrast sharpens between the neat handwriting of the ledger and the spectacle it described. The very tools designed to impose order, account books, schedules, wages, became, in this case, instruments of the disorder's persistence. The absurdity lay not in the effort itself, but in the mismatch between the tools at hand and the problem they were meant to address. In a society where illness could be moral failing, spiritual attack, or imbalance of humours, a council could easily imagine that the solution might also straddle the line between ritual and remedy. That this particular remedy required fiddlers to play until their arms ached was simply the form it took in 1518. For the participants, the absurdity was perhaps less visible. A dancer moving without choice had no reason to question whether the music was meant to help or harm. Spectators, however, could not help but see the contradiction. A civic authority trying to restore dignity by orchestrating a public display of its absence. It was a strange kind of order, meticulously arranged chaos. Such measures were not unique to Strasbourg. Other outbreaks, as far away as Italy, produced their own rituals, prescribed steps, sanctioned musicians, designated spaces. Each community fashioned its own blend of medical theory, religious observance, and municipal management, often producing results that seemed to confirm the original confusion. In the years that followed, Strasbourg's episode became an object lesson, though no one agreed on what the lesson was. Some read it as a warning about divine displeasure, others as a case study in humoral imbalance. A few, with less solemnity, simply repeated the tale as an example of how a city might hire an entire band to play for people who wished they could leave the dance floor. The persistence of these details in memory owes something to their theatrical quality. They are easier to picture than the long hours of exhaustion, the quiet departures, or the gradual fading of symptoms. A hall full of unwilling dancers and paid musicians is a tableau that resists being forgotten, even when the rest of the episode blurs into general strangeness. By the time the 1518 outbreak was consigned to history, the absurd elements had fused with the factual, becoming part of the official story. The city moved on, but the image of Strasbourg as a place where the cure for dancing was more dancing endured. In the realm of civic memory, it was the kind of paradox that could outlast reason. And so the summer left its mark not in stone, but in the quiet conviction that sometimes the mechanisms of governance, designed to keep a city steady, can, when confronted with the inexplicable, produce outcomes every bit as surreal as the disorder they are meant to cure. In Strasbourg, that outcome was a dance without end, brought to you by the very hands that hoped to stop it. By autumn, the city's streets had the old sounds again. The clop of cartwheels, the low hum of traders haggling, the toll of the cathedral bells marking the hours. The dance had receded, leaving no monument, no marker, only the knowledge that it had happened. Cobblestones once worn smooth under countless unwilling steps now bore the ordinary scuff of boots bound for market or chapel. The air, cool and dry, held no trace of the fevered summer. Yet absence is not erasure. In certain corners, a passerby might still imagine the faint pulse of drums, or the rise and fall of feet in unison. A scrap of melody from a nearby tavern could make a merchant glance up sharply, as if to check that the sound was not carrying the wrong kind of weight. For those who had seen the outbreak, the memory was stitched invisibly into the fabric of the city. The council's ledgers closed the matter with the same precision they had opened it. Expenses paid, accounts balanced, case concluded. But paper cannot hold the unease of watching one's own neighbours move, as though the city itself had seized their bodies. That knowledge remained, unwritten, passed quietly in the pauses between other stories. In time, the tale was told in softened tones, part cautionary account, part curiosity for visitors, part entertainment for those far removed from its reality. But in the streets where it had happened, the memory was less a story than a shadow. cast by an event that refused to resolve into pure fact or pure fable. Strasbourg returned to its rhythms. The market thrived again, sermons drew full congregations, and the river carried its steady trade. But beneath the ordinary pulse ran the reminder that order, however solid, is only a skin. Beneath it, there is always the potential for a rhythm no one asks for, to which a whole city might move without knowing why. And so the summer of 1518 settled into history, not as the year of plague or fire or war, but as the year the streets became a stage, and the actors did not know their lines. The audience was the city itself, watching helplessly as the performance carried on. The silence that followed was complete, but in that silence, for those who had heard it once, the echo of that impossible rhythm could still return, soft as a remembered heartbeat, steady as the knowledge that it could, without warning, begin again.